Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Conservation Options in Estate Planning. My name is Julia Froik. I am the project coordinator here at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management and will be hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by Jennifer Filipiak, Midwest Regional Director at American Farmland Trust, who will provide a brief introduction on AFT. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Jerry Cosgrove, Farm Legacy Director and a Senior Advisor at American Farmland Trust. Before we begin, I will go over some brief logistics. Please remember to submit questions for Jerry on the GoToWebinar panel during his presentation. I will moderate the questions for approximately 10 minutes after the presentation. You will receive an email in the next few days with the webinar recording and link to the webinar evaluation. The recording will also be available on partnershipfarm.org and YouTube. By attending today's webinar, you are eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for professional development and 0.5 for crop management. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are watching the webinar live, no further action is required to submit your CEUs. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch the entire presentation through the GoToWebinar platform and not YouTube to receive credit. If you watch the webinar recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast, please email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your credits are submitted. Please note that credits often take a few weeks to appear in your account. If it has been more than 4 weeks, please contact my email. And now, with the logistics taken care of, I will provide a quick introduction to the Great Lakes Conservation Connect project. Great Lakes Conservation Connect is a collaborative partnership of conservation agencies focused on engaging both women non-operator landowners and farmer tenants to work together to increase conservation practices on their land. Why women? Because we have a successful model to engage them, and research shows they are interested. We'll hear more about that in a minute. Really, we're starting with women, but much of what we're learning applies to all non-farming landowners. A key component to our goal is increased communication between the farmer and landowner to enable leasing structures that make it easier for farmers to try new practices. PARM's role in the project is to engage ag retailers to provide resources to their clientele to help integrate beneficial practices on rented lands. The benefits of talking with your customers include selling additional products and services on rented lands, and with extended lease terms, you can secure your clientele for a longer period. We have created a brochure for ag retailers as a handout for their customers. Order several now for free and pass them out at your next grower meeting. Contact Julia at partnershipfarm.org to order. Lastly, to access additional information, visit the Farmland Information Center. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Filipiak, who will provide an introduction on American Farmland Trust's role in Great Lakes Conservation Connect.
Hi. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jen Filipiak. As Julia said, I am the Midwest Regional Director for American Farmland Trust. And I thought I'd start just giving you guys a screenshot here of our mission. AFT is a national nonprofit organization. We have about 6 regional offices, I believe is the total right now. We're looking at opening a new office in the Southeast, actually. Our national office is in Washington, D.C., and we have about 70 staff nationwide, so that gives you a little feel for our reach. Our mission is to protect farm and ranch land, to promote sound farming practices, and to keep farmers on the land. So we were founded in 1980 when there was a lot of rapid urbanization happening on both coasts, but we realized even back then that you can't really protect farmland. You can't call it protected if it's not managed well, so it can keep producing well into the future. And you can't really say that you've protected farmland if a farmer can't make a living off that land. So that is our 3-pronged mission. A little bit about AFT. You can advance the slide, Julia. So our goal with this project, as Julia mentioned, is it's a very large project. There's a lot of partners involved, and AFT's role in this project is we're facilitating the project. We're managing all the partners, all the different pieces of this large project. And in a nutshell, we're trying to test ways to improve or to increase conservation on rented farmland. And we're doing that through 3 audiences. So the women landowners, the farmers who rent the land, and then the retailers. And I'm going to focus on, in the next couple of slides, that successful model that Julia mentioned in her introductory comments, and talk a little bit about what we're doing with women landowners in this project. So we're using a conservation learning circle model. This is a peer-to-peer educational model. It acknowledges the women landowners as the experts and decision makers on their own land. That is not a role that they're necessarily comfortable in, or a role that they've had for a long time. They might have assumed that role because someone passed away or parents are ill. So that's what the learning circle is. This is a model that was actually developed to be used with non-operating landowners by an organization in Iowa called the Women Food and Agriculture Network back in 2009. So the idea behind the conservation learning circle, again, we all gather together. We sit in a circle, as you can see. We invite conservation staff and agricultural professionals to come and participate in the discussion and help us talk about whatever the topic of the day is. It could be soil health, it could be water quality, it could be our topic today, your land is your legacy. And the idea is that when you look at this picture, it's very hard to tell who the landowner is and who the resource professional is. And those things are often blended. A lot of our resource professionals are landowners themselves. And that's on purpose. It's to not have a hierarchy. We don't do lectures. It's not like a conference kind of setting. It feels very informal. And when we have these meetings without men for the first part of the day, generally speaking, we'll make exceptions sometimes, but we generally try to make them without men for the first part of the day. And this is not to sit around so we can bash men. The reason we do that is it really helps these landowners open up and ask their quote-unquote stupid questions. They feel much more comfortable sharing their stories and their situations and getting feedback on how they can manage their farms well and how they can help their farmers to do that too. So it's a full day meeting. It starts with a morning discussion, technical discussion, and then in the afternoon, that's where we'll invite men in because we want them to know who their local resource professionals are, regardless of gender. And so we'll have a broader audience at the field day. And then we wrap up around 3 p.m. With a little bit of discussion. So the next slide, the results are very good. The women that attend these meetings, they pretty much unanimously rank them as very good or excellent. They love the conversation and the networking that they can do. My impressions, I've done many of these now. I've actually lost count. I've talked to hundreds of women landowners in several states, mostly in Illinois and Indiana. And my impressions after doing so many of these is that these landowners, they're hungry for information and they're not quite sure how to get that information. They don't necessarily know who NRCS is. They are interested in the detail and the technical. So they want the information and they don't shy away from technical information. You just have to use plain language when you describe it. You just need to avoid the jargon. Another really strong sentiment that I get is that they truly consider their farmer to be the expert, and family harmony and community harmony and managing that land, it's very important to them. And they actually use the term my farmer. They don't say my tenant or the guy who rents my land. It's my farmer, and they trust them that they're making good decisions, and they trust them as experts in agriculture. And in fact, they would love to talk with their farmer more, but they don't want to burden him. They understand that it's a complex job, and they want to be careful about taking up his time, but they would love to talk more about their land with their farmer. All the chemicals thing there, that's not an indication that all these women really want to go full organic or anything like that. It's more of they just want to understand what the chemicals are for, how they're used, and they want to understand too if there's ways maybe they could dial it back. A lot of them are interested in how can we be more efficient with chemicals and maybe use less chemicals. It often hasn't really occurred to them that they can change the lease. So, and when you do say that to them and you talk about that, they're pretty open to it. And then the idea of succession planning and that love of the land. So even though they don't farm the land, even though they generally don't even live on the land, but they might live still nearby. They really, really care about this land, and they want to feel like it's being managed well, and they trust that their farmer does that. So this is all good news for the farmer. You can go to the next slide, my final slide. This kind of anecdotal data, my experience, is really backed up by a survey that we're conducting. We're right in the middle of this survey. We're looking at 11 states. We're surveying non-operating landowners, all genders. And some preliminary findings we're finding, this is based on Midwestern data that we have back. The sources of information that they use to make decisions about their land are generally also the sources that they trust the most. So my farmer is the source that they use and that they trust. They mention conservation agencies at a fairly high rate if they know who they are. We also, a fairly high percentage say, I don't have any sources of information. I don't know where to get information. They're ranking pretty high. They're interested in soil and water quality. They trust their farmer. They're comfortable changing lease terms. They're comfortable asking about conservation. There's still a lot of crop share leases in Illinois and Indiana, also in Ohio. I've been looking at that data lately too. And still lots and lots of verbal lease agreements. These leases are majority, they're the annual term leases, but when you ask how long have you been renting to this same farmer, the average is 15 to 18 years, depending on the state. So these are long-term relationships that are technically renewed annually, but they're long-term relationships. So in close, just two key points. The first key point, these landowners care about the land, and it's not just about the rent for them. They want to feel comfortable and be able to trust their farmer that good decisions are being made and the land is being cared for. It's very important to them. And number two, if you're a farmer who wants to do conservation, our data and my experience is saying, if you go to your landowner and say, I think your land needs some conservation practices, maybe some soil erosion control type stuff, your landowner is going to be very supportive of that. They're going to welcome that conversation. And I even have been hearing of more and more examples of landowners, once the farmer asks, the landowner is willing to financially support that too. So, not every case, but it's good news if you're a farmer that wants to do conservation. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Jen. Now, before we begin the presentation, I have a few brief PARM announcements. Our next webinar in our pollinator series airs September 18th and will discuss honeybees and agriculture. Look for announcements in your email, on Facebook, and Twitter. Our regular PARM webinar series will resume in late November, topic and date to be determined. And remember, we take into consideration your suggestions for webinar topics, so be sure to fill out our evaluation form after the webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Sustainability Programming for Ag Retailers and CCAs, or SPARC. SPARC is a partnership between the Agricultural Retailers Association, the American Society of Agronomy, Environmental Defense Fund, and Field to Market. We will now hear from Luther Smith, Director of Professional Development and Business Relations at the American Society of Agronomy, who will provide a brief introduction to SPARC.
Thank you, Julia. And we'll share my screen here quickly.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm just going to talk with you for a few minutes about SPARC, as Julie introduced. It's Sustainability Programming for Ag Retailers and CCAs. And the group that came together around this, American Society of Agronomy, where I work, being one of those groups, and the Certified Crop Advisor Program, really wanted to provide information, education around sustainability. And I want to go through a few slides, and first a disclaimer. There's more slides here than the time that I'm going to talk with you about, but I wanted you to have the information that they contain. So you'll have all these slides in the recorded version of the webinar that you'll receive probably within the week from PARM. So if you don't get to write something down as I go through this slide, because I'm going to go through them quickly, just remember you will get this information in a few days, so you'll have that for you. So what's really driving this around sustainability when you think of the last 5 years? Just think of a friend of yours that has no connection to production agriculture. And you probably have friends like that, and they would maybe hear about it from you, someone who's working within the production agriculture area. But those consumers, as all of us do, we buy food and we influence the sellers of that food on what they're providing us. So they are telling those companies, those food companies and retailers, what's important to them around what's happening at the farm level. And as you've heard, in that same time period, many of these companies have made very public statements of how they're going to become much more sustainable in what they're providing. And they quickly realize that they have to get all the way back to the farm to really achieve those goals. And that's where you are, the certified crop advisor, the ag retailer. And they want to connect with you on what they can make happen at the farm level. So when you think of the ag supply chain, and here's a pictorial of it, you are at the beginning of it. And that's where they need to reach in order to achieve their goals. What's happening at the farm level where those raw ingredients are produced that get used by the food company or end up at the retailer and eventually to the consumer. And so they can say, we're achieving sustainability goals. So I'm going to quickly review some of these larger businesses and what they're doing. And just to give you an idea what they're working on. Walmart is the first one I pulled up. And each one of these slides has a web link, so you can go look at this and get more details about it. So this is just a brief introduction. They're working on a project they call Gigaton, where they're looking at reducing nutrient loss, and they're focused on that. Implementing more cover crop use, conservation tillage, and really looking at science-based nutrient management. And they're really focused on doing this on multiple millions of acres. McDonald's, looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, conserving water. And you'll see a theme through some of these. Kellogg's, conserving natural resources, reducing energy use, reducing water use. General Mills, who we've partnered on with several projects around education for CCAs. Again, reducing greenhouse gases, reducing water use. PepsiCo, improving efficiencies and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a common thing in there, comes up a lot: greenhouse gas emissions, water use efficiency, nutrient use. You, as the expert working with the farmer at the farm level, can influence that. You're viewed as that part of it. As we've talked to farmers about the CCA program, many of them say they really rely on their CCA that they see on a regular basis. So you influence what type of products they're going to use, what types of practices they're going to implement, and the services that you provide them. And you can help them move in that direction on sustainability. So SPARC, the initiative that was mentioned, here's our mission and vision, and it's a collaboration, as Julie introduced, of these organizations, American Society of Agronomy and the Certified Crop Advisor Program being one of them, the Ag Retailers Association, Environmental Defense Fund, and Field to Market, coming together to provide you with resources that you can use. So what do we offer through this initiative and what's available to you? The first group is a set of online modules we developed with Field to Market. There's 6 of them, and you can access them on our website or on any of the organization's websites and earn continuing education. These are very much at the beginning stage. So if you're really getting started in the sustainability area, these would be a great set of modules to view and look at the information. There's a manual that also goes with these, the modules. So maybe you want to bring a group together, a group of growers, a group of fellow employees to talk about what you could be working on, and the manual helps lay that out for you. So you can view the modules together, but also use the manual in a training session. Those are available to you. There's fact sheets. These fact sheets cover these 8 topic areas, and these 8 areas are part of the Field Print Calculator. So if you haven't used that yet, you can download that from Field to Market. That calculator helps you evaluate a farm to see where they're at in their sustainability area. So it gives a chance for a farmer to get a ranking, and then as they make changes, they can track those rankings, and you can help them do that with the information that's available. And these are the main areas that they're gonna focus on. That's also important to a food company or a retailer. If they're looking to work with that grower, buy that grower's products, and they can provide this information, that's important to those retailers as well, and the food companies. And there's also case studies. You can take a look at these and learn from other producers, what they've been doing, what kind of results are they seeing. And maybe those are things you could help adapt for your grower clientele. And finally, there's Articles in Crops and Soils magazine. As a CCA, you should be receiving this magazine every other month from us. And you can also see articles in there about topics that are related to sustainability. So again, you can access all this information through any one of these groups, whichever one you're familiar with. Here are people you can contact for more information. Myself is on here, Luther Smith, as well as Donnie Taylor from Ag Retailers, Jamie Powers from EDF, and then Kelly Young at Field to Market. So thank you for the time and enjoy the webinar today.
Thank you, Luther, and to all of SPARC for being our sponsor today. And now we'll get the presentation started with Jerry Cosgrove, Farm Legacy Director and a Senior Advisor at American Farmland Trust.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. Very eager to walk through some of these issues. A couple general comments about myself before I get started. First, I am an attorney. I've been licensed to practice law for 30 years. I have worked with American Farmland Trust for many of those years, and now I'm focused on farm conservation projects, farm transfer, land access, and as Julia mentioned, our Farm Legacy program. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the focus of my presentation today is really looking at the intersection of farm transfer, estate planning, and farm conservation, subject I've worked on for most of my professional career here at AFT. And one of the things now that I think has made the issue of farm transfer more significant and pressing is the aging of our farm owners across the country. Present data shows that in the next 10 to 20 years, 40% of America's farmland, that's 370 million acres, is going to transfer from one generation to the next. And this is something that's really gotten AFT's attention. We've been focusing on it in a number of ways. Again, the program, one of the aspects of the program that Jen works on with women landowners. I've been privileged to participate in some of those learning circles, talking about farm transfer, again, very much on the minds of those landowners. But also, we've been doing training, working on land access across the country. In New York State, where I'm from, there's a program where they're working across the state, developing resources and contacts to help provide more information and facilitate the discussion, similar to the discussion we're going to be having this morning on our farm transfer and conservation options. And one of the things I would note from the sort of group that's present, in particular, a number of ag retailer advisors, crop consultants, you're really in an excellent position to help facilitate, evaluate, and encourage the farmers and landowners that you work with to start thinking about the future of their farmland, the next generation, as Jen mentioned, their farm legacy, so to speak. And I'm going to be talking about some of the issues there. And now I'm trying to switch the slides.
Jerry, if you click on the slide, and then now you should have those arrows at the bottom.
Yeah, I'm not. Okay,
there
we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I'm going to be talking about farm transfer and estate planning. And one of the perspectives I bring to the table because of my work at AFT in thinking about this over the last 30 years is that farm transfer and estate planning I view as very important farm protection tools. They dovetail well with the long-term future of agriculture and farmland. And I think in many cases, from a policy and even perhaps from the individual landowner's perspective, I think there's been a tendency to overlook them. And I think it's important, again, from my perspective, to think about how to integrate them, because when you think about it, you're really looking at sort of the long-term future of land when you're thinking about transferring it to the next generation, transferring it to future family members, and also in many cases, the landowners in particular, as Jen mentioned, and I think we've all experienced, really love their land. And it's very important that they feel comfortable and in some cases assured that the land is going to be continued to be farmed and well stewarded into the future. The other thing, as we go through the presentation, I recognize that there's going to be a number of different perspectives to think about, certainly the folks participating in the webinar, but also the folks as you work with landowners, with farmers who own land, with farmers who rent land. And so sometimes those perspectives can vary a little bit, but I think it is important to recognize that, from whatever perspective, I think most landowners care about the future of their land and really want to think about, how to keep it in agriculture. When we think about farms and farmland, while farmland is a natural resource, farms and farm operations are businesses. And so, again, particularly when the land is both owned and operated by a farmer, the fact that they're in a business and have sort of economic needs in the short term really will shape their priorities and concerns. The priority may be a little bit different for a landowner who's not actively farming, but again, in many cases, it's important for the landowner and the farmer who may be renting their land to be on the same page in terms of the priorities and the future disposition of that land. In some cases, it may be a long-term rental arrangement, and in some cases, it may be a potential future sale down the road. What I found is that communications are critical, whether you're talking about a transfer within a family, transfer between unrelated parties, or essentially a transfer to sort of potentially an unknown party. Having the appropriate communications and being on the same page in terms of the priorities is really critical. One of the things I think that's important to recognize too is that farm transfer and estate planning is a process. And as a process, it generally takes time. And what I've found over the years is that the sooner folks start thinking about what they want to happen with the future of their farmland, or in some cases their farm business, the sooner they start thinking about that and taking active steps to facilitate that transfer, the better. For example, in the ideal world, I think that landowners or farmers should, while they're still in their 50s, should be starting to think about what's going to happen to the farmland next, what's going to happen to the farm business next. I find that once they reach 60, it's an even better time in some respects, because many are starting to think more short-term about retirement or scaling back or actively shifting the business or the management of the land. And I also find that by the time folks reach the age of 70, from my perspective, it's really critical that they start, if they haven't already, that they start taking active steps to think and plan and get the wheels in motion for the future of their farmland. Because what I've observed is that by the time folks are later in their 70s or approaching or reaching 80, it becomes very difficult to think through what can be a somewhat overwhelming or complex process. And so again, I mean, the short takeaway here is that starting sooner is better, recognizing that it's a process and it's not something that you really can or should do in a short period of time. We're talking process that generally takes years, not months. And I really break down the basic goals of farm transfer. Again, these are depending on whether you have an active farm or you merely rent farm. You may have different priorities in terms of these goals, but they exist nonetheless to transfer active farmland. One is obviously As Jen mentioned, the management skills and responsibility for stewarding the land. Very critical, very important, takes a specialized set of skills to both farmland economically, make a profit, but also to steward the land from a conservation perspective. Many farm operations, it happens naturally from one generation to the next, but increasingly I think there's a recognition that actively stewarding the transfer of these skills and responsibility in terms of the farm operation is important and needs to be done again sooner than later. Then of course there's the actual transfer of the assets. In this case, we're talking about the real estate assets, the farmland. Again, lots of ways to do that. We'll talk about some of the mechanisms, but generally speaking, they can be either transferred during your lifetime or at death. Again, depending on the situation, sometimes a gradual transfer over time using installment payments can be a useful way to achieve that objective. But in many cases, the land is going to transfer upon death. And then lastly, and this is a very important component, ensuring financial security and peace of mind. And I would say that one observation I would make is that financial security is important, but I found with the landowners that I work with, the notion of peace of mind and having the comfort that the land is going to be well cared for and that the landowner has done their job, so to speak, to transfer the land to the next generation, I don't think gets as much attention as it should. Sometimes the financial planners or the professional advisors will be very focused on the mechanics or the financial implications or the tax implications. But I find for many landowners, while their farmland may not be their most valuable asset, though in many cases it is, it's really their most important asset, and they really want to know what's going to happen to it in the future. And again, as someone who's worked on farmland conservation for most of my professional career, I fully understand and appreciate that. And frankly, in my role at AFT and as an organization, we support that effort. So I'm going to talk primarily today about the conservation option utilizing a conservation easement. And a conservation easement, in my view, should be part of a plan. It's not a be-all and end-all. One of the things I learned early on in my career was that when landowners were thinking about conservation easements, permanently protecting their land, it often raised other issues about the future of their farm, their estate planning, and important issues that what I learned early on that needed to be addressed as part of the consideration of and discussion about a conservation easement. Really two ways to convey them. They can be donated to a not-for-profit like American Farmland Trust or sold. There are many programs across the country, increasing numbers of programs that will either state or private entities will actually purchase conservation easements in order to permanently protect land. They can also be incorporated into a will or trust. This is essentially, I would characterize it as a conservation insurance policy that folks may not be ready or able to permanently protect their land during their lifetime, but it's certainly an option, again, with many landowners that I've worked with over the years, that gives them that peace of mind that they're directing whoever's going to be administering their trust or executing their will have instructions that the land needs to be protected for future agricultural use. So conservation easements are a legal tool. They're a deed restriction on future uses of the land. Again, we'll come back in the next slide to talk a little bit more about what makes an agricultural conservation easement different. But they are also deed restrictions that focus on sort of agricultural capacity of land. One of the reasons why these deed restrictions are very popular with landowners is that they're voluntary. These are essentially either donated or in cases where the easements are purchased, it's a transaction that involves essentially a willing seller or in some cases a willing donor of the property interest. By and large, though there are some exceptions, these deed restrictions are permanent. They quote unquote run with the land. They're part of the permanent property records. The deed of easement is recorded and operates as a permanent restriction on the future use of the land. So it's not a transaction that can or should be taken lightly. And again, an important reason why the process should be allowed to proceed at a very thoughtful pace. This is not something that we would want to see landowners rush into in an emergency situation, if at all possible. One of the things that's important to remember is that the deed restriction does not technically convey any rights to develop the land to the holder. So for example, if a landowner were to convey by gift a conservation easement to American Farmland Trust, we would not have the ability to implement those restricted uses in the future. They're essentially, those uses are extinguished, but what AFT would be under obligation to do would be to enforce the terms of the deed restriction. Again, permanently over the course of the ownership of that property. In addition, the property stays on the tax rolls. It's not, again, it wouldn't be owned by the nonprofit necessarily. The nonprofit would hold the enforcement obligations on the deed restriction. So the land would continue to stay on the tax rolls. In most cases, these properties are already receiving use value agricultural assessment. So the property tax implications really aren't going to change for either the owner or the municipality. And these properties can be sold, leased, or otherwise transferred by gift or request. Again, subject to the terms of the restriction, but that's really the only limitation on the future use of the land. It still can be sold, leased, conveyed, however the landowner would want. So at AFT, we work primarily with agricultural easements. These are easements that are tailored for agricultural properties. Not surprisingly, not all easements are the same. Many have different conservation purposes. The purposes of an agricultural easement really focus on the agricultural productivity. So by and large, they limit uses that would be inconsistent with agricultural productivity. Primarily subdivision of the land into small lots, conversion of the land into residential or commercial or industrial uses, and really any other use that would be detrimental to the agricultural productivity. Most agricultural easements that American Farmland Trust drafts and works on and encourages are easements that actually not only limit uses inconsistent with agricultural productivity, but also they're designed to encourage and support agricultural use. And this really is done primarily by making the terms of the easement fairly flexible, recognizing that, again, as we said at the outset, farms are businesses. Agriculture is an active activity on the land, which requires a lot of human activity to make the land productive over time. And again, in many cases that will require some structures, buildings for livestock or equipment or to store grain or other products that are produced on the farm. It also probably may well require infrastructure improvements, tile drainage, irrigation. There's many additional improvements that often are important to make to the land to increase and maintain its productivity all over the long term. In addition, an agricultural easement really supports the right to farm and any local agricultural land uses. Again, it's important to recognize that agricultural easements are not a substitute for local planning and zoning, but in the best case should complement what's happening on the ground locally. Generally speaking, most of the agricultural easements that we will undertake occur on land in farming areas that are included in agricultural districts, and generally speaking in areas where there are going to be other farm neighbors. Importantly, especially for agricultural easements, is that public access is not required. The terminology that's used, easement, for some folks may convey some kind of right of access, but that's not the case. And certainly with agricultural easements, in most cases, public access doesn't really make sense and could potentially conflict with the agricultural operation, because as we know, they can be very large scale and not something that you want the public being exposed to. Could be dangerous for both the farming operation, but more importantly to anybody who might wander onto a farm. So again, most easements don't provide for public access, and as I said before, they can be either donated or sold, or a combination of sale and gift, what's known as a bargain sale. These many programs will pay a percentage of the value in order to provide some funding to a landowner who wants to convey a conservation easement, but who is also in the position or willing to provide some sort of bargain sale in order to permanently protect their land for agricultural use. As I mentioned before, I think one of the critical points that I've observed over the years is that in thinking about agricultural easements, it's very important to integrate them with the planning considerations more generally with respect to the transfer of a farming operation or a farm, or in the context of a farm transfer or estate plan. And I'm going to go through 4 planning considerations that I think are critical to really integrate into the thought process when considering whether an agricultural easement makes sense for a particular piece of land. There's potential impacts on the farm business. It's important to think about the land planning, how the various use areas will relate to each other. Of course, there are always tax implications need to be considered and understood. And then in the larger context of estate planning and farm transfer, again, generally speaking, I think agricultural easements can be an important tool in that respect as well. So in terms of the drafting the agricultural easement, it's important to assess the impact on the farm business. Again, from my experience, a properly drafted agricultural easement will have a minimal impact on the business, and in fact, if drafted properly, may well enhance the farm business potential down the road. But again, the things to consider are pretty straightforward. What is the current operation? But importantly, for easements, because they're permanent, really having a discussion and giving thought to the future operation, what it may look like in the future, or potential new enterprises, critical to think about that up front. I like to run people through what I would call the what if scenarios, thinking out loud about various future scenarios, new enterprises, and then sort of comparing them to the language and the structure of the easement to make sure that those potential new enterprises or future ag operations are going to be accommodated by the terms of the easement. One of these, I think, that's particularly critical in times of tight profit margins in agriculture is diversification. Are there other agricultural or other compatible rural enterprises that may help the future viability and economic prospects for that farm business? Again, it's these days you can draft an easement that accommodates those enterprises one way or the other, particularly by creative land planning, but it's important to think about that. Another key aspect to think about is, the size of farms today may not be the appropriate scale or size of farms tomorrow. And the next slide, the next point, downsizing, what we find in some cases in the Northeast is that there are operations that actually want to get smaller. They want to farm less land. They plan to farm it more intensively, provide more improvements, and really, may only want a portion of a farm. So that's an important consideration up front to allow for that possibility if that's something that might make sense down the road. Similarly, expansion of farming operations, again, creating areas where expansion of agricultural structures, again, particularly in the livestock industry, we've seen larger and larger livestock facilities. Down the road, you want to make sure that the easement will allow for that, particularly in areas where you've got expanding scale of livestock businesses, especially in the dairy industry across the country. And I think increasingly thinking creatively about renewable energy options. Again, many farms, I think, have availed themselves of wind power, increasingly solar energy as ways to diversify their income stream, again, take on some of the impacts of climate change. And again, these are potentially new enterprises, ways to create new revenue streams for farms, and can and should be thought about in thinking about how you put together a conservation easement. We'll talk about land planning in a moment, but I think in terms of the farm business impacts, the one takeaway word from my perspective is to think about flexibility. No one really knows the future of agriculture, the future of weather and climate down the road, and so I think it behooves us to think about how to create flexibility within the context of an agricultural easement, again, respecting the agricultural resources. And really the way you do that is by land planning from my perspective. Again, thinking about ag buildings, structures, improvements, those are in most ag operations will be needed. The question is really, where should they be located? Are there areas where they should be prohibited? How big will they be? So how much area should you allocate for future structures and buildings? And then importantly, who's going to decide if there's a dispute? And these are all provisions that can and should be articulated in the context of language in an agricultural easement. Similarly, rural enterprises. Are they allowed? Are compatible enterprises that aren't strictly agriculture allowed? Again, at American Farmland Trust, our view is that if the enterprise is not inconsistent or detrimental with the agricultural use, we strongly support a wide range of rural enterprises. Then of course the question is going to be where should they be located? Generally speaking, they're designated in development areas or farmstead areas to kind of limit the potential spillover impact on the agricultural land. But again, there's a lot of different ways to achieve these objectives, and the key element in terms of the planning process is to think about what uses there might be, have that discussion, and to make a thoughtful decision about where they might be allowed. Similarly, farm labor housing, important on some types of farm operations. Where is the farm labor going to be located? Is it going to be as part of the general farmstead? Is there going to be a separate farm labor area? Again, no right answer depending on where you are in the country or what type of farm operation, or certainly from the landowner's perspective, what their preferences might be, but certainly an issue that needs to be thought about and addressed. Family housing, again, important. Generally speaking, there's a residence on the farm. What's the need going to be for future family housing and related to that, retirement housing? Is the retiring farm owner, farm manager going to want or need retirement housing on the farm? If so, where would that be located? How to accommodate for that in the context of an easement? And then increasingly, we've seen many easements probably over the last 10 to 15 years really focus on carving out resource protection areas for resources that need special attention. Again, in particular, in many farms, you're talking about steep slopes, riparian buffer areas, wetlands. Again, relatively easy to identify and map them on a conservation easement map, and generally speaking, provide for additional protections in terms of perhaps limiting farming in those areas, or even in some cases prohibiting farming in those areas, again, as a more targeted way to address some of those resource protection concerns. Well, there's always tax implications. The good news, I think, is that they're relatively straightforward. The bad news is, particularly if you're selling an easement, it's pretty hard to avoid paying capital gains on a sale of a conservation easement, primarily because most farms appreciate significantly over time. They've been held for many, many years. And so much of the proceeds of the sale of an easement is going to be capital gain. I had one client I work with. He purchased his farm in the Hudson Valley for $10,000 in 1960. When we did the transaction a couple of years ago, his farm was worth over $1 million. And he sold an easement for several hundreds of thousands of dollars. Almost all of that sale proceeds was capital gain. He had a very significant tax bill, really no way around it. One of the things at AFT that we're going to be working on over the next few years is to try to get some of the capital gains rules changed for sales of conservation easements, because from our perspective, it doesn't really make sense from a public policy perspective to tax the gain on a sale that's for conservation. One of the ways you can address the capital gains issue is what's known as a like-kind exchange. It's essentially a trade of property. It allows you to defer the capital gains tax, something many tax advisors are interested in doing. If you donate an easement, it's eligible for an income tax deduction for the value of the conservation easement that's donated to a nonprofit. Again, a qualified nonprofit such as American Farmland Trust. For example, if you donated an easement worth $100,000, you would be eligible for a tax deduction in that amount. One of the challenges with income tax deduction is that you really need income to utilize it. But for agricultural properties and farmers, the carry forward rules have been expanded so that it gives landowners up to 15 years to carry forward the deduction, gives a longer opportunity to make full use of the deduction. There's also gift and estate tax benefits. Again, these are less relevant now that we have exemption levels that are much, much higher than they used to be when I started working in this area many years ago. But the fact is that if the land is restricted by an agricultural conservation easement, it will be valued at its restricted value, not its fair market value. And of course, some states have inheritance taxes, and these easements would also provide some benefit for state inheritance or estate taxes as well. And lastly, and importantly, in the larger scheme of farm transfer and estate planning, easements can be a very important tool. One, as I mentioned earlier, but it's important to reiterate, integrating and coordinating an easement with the farm transfer and estate planning is important. Generally speaking, I find that it's better to convey an agricultural easement before a transfer, and at a minimum, at least as part of the estate planning process. Again, it's usually a timing issue, but I have found that it's easier to do these transactions if there are fewer decision makers. So for example, if the farm is going to go to the children, I encourage the parents to think about protecting the farm first, so that they are the decision makers and that they're not leaving it up to try to reach a consensus among 2, 3, 4 or more children. That can be challenging, and I've seen it unwind transactions in a number of instances when one child, for whatever reason, is not interested in protecting the land for future agricultural use. And lastly, and this gets to the peace of mind issue, it's really important for the long-term transfer to have clarity on purpose and future impact on the land. Again, you know, the conservation easement is going to keep the land available and protected for future agricultural use. Not every landowner wants to do that, but there are many who care a lot about what's going to happen in the future. And I find that utilizing an agricultural easement is one very useful way to do that. It's a permanent deed restriction that sets forth what can and can't be done with that land in the future, and that all future owners, whether they're family members, near or far, or non-family members, or even, you know, a large corporate farm, they have to respect the terms of those deed restrictions that are designed and intended to be permanent. And again, at AFT, this is an obligation. This is a tool that we've supported over the course of our existence, over our close to 40 years, because we believe it's important both for the farmland, but also for the landowners who want to see their land stay in agriculture. Just going to quickly run through, I'm mindful of the time and want to make sure that we have a chance for some questions. Purchase of agricultural conservation easements, or purchase of development rights as they're known, because one of the things I found early on is that these purchase programs can be a very effective farm transfer tool. Does two things. One, obviously it protects the farm for future agricultural use, but it also helps resolve some of the challenging planning issues that I've seen over the years. And frankly, the first and perhaps most important benefit that it has, it's a great catalyst for planning. And this is true whether it's a purchased or donated easement. It was an observation that a farmer made to me many, many years ago, that I was giving a presentation on agricultural conservation easements, and the farmer came up and said, you know, this is a big decision. And he said, you really shouldn't be thinking about doing something like this unless you've really thought about everything else you need to do to transfer the farm. And it was a light bulb moment for me, and I realized that he was exactly right. And so I think recognizing that this is a way to really provide a catalyst for planning, again, whether it's a donated or a purchased easement. But the purchased easements also help address some planning challenges. One is liquidity. Again, farm landowners are notoriously land rich and cash poor. Selling an easement can generate some cash that can be used for other purposes. That's without necessarily liquidating the farm in its entirety. It also helps address fair versus equal. Again, you've got the farming sibling child and non-farming sibling children. And, you know, in many cases, parents are reluctant to give the farm to the farming child or children because they think it's unfair not to divide the property equally. And I would argue that it's probably the worst thing that can be done, and I've seen it done over and over and over, that fair isn't equal. And it's particularly unfair to the farming child or children, or even if it's not someone who's related, the person who wants to farm the land, because they're really not in a position, in most cases, to buy out other owners of the property. Again, selling development rights can help address that issue by providing some of the sale proceeds to the non-farming future owners of the property. Again, depending on where you are in the country, if you're in an area that's experiencing urban or suburban growth or second home development, conservation easements can make land more affordable. They reduce the value of the land to its agricultural value, and make it more affordable from an agricultural perspective without having to necessarily compete dollar for dollar in the open market with a developer. In the short term, sadly, there's always going to be more profit developing land than there is in farming it. But again, from our perspective and from many of the landowners we work with, that's extremely short-sighted. Farm viability, again, the proceeds from the sale of easements can be used to reinvest in the farm business, start new enterprises, improve infrastructure, facilitate intergenerational transfers at a more affordable rate, really can help directly with farm viability. And we've seen that in many, many instances, particularly here in the Northeast, where we have a long history of farmland protection programs dating back into the 1970s. And lastly, and certainly importantly in many cases, because often the land is the retirement account, selling an easement is a way to generate funds for retirement for a landowner without necessarily having them have to either sell the land to a developer or sell it outright. They could generate some proceeds, continue to own the land, and again, know that the land will be permanently protected for future ag use. Before I close, I'm going to quickly run through some other conservation options. These are not necessarily for landowners who have successors in waiting, but many landowners I work with don't have any successors and are very concerned about the future of their land and don't want to just leave it to chance. The program that I direct, the Farm Legacy Program, really focuses on those landowners who don't have successors, who want to see their land stay in agriculture. And I've had many conversations where they consider donating their farm or ranch to AFT as a way to keep it in agricultural use, because many charities, as worthy as those causes may be, don't have the same mission as AFT. And if they receive a donation of land, they will immediately sell it to the highest bidder. That's from AFT's perspective. Given our mission, we don't do that. Again, donations can be conveyed during lifetime in a will or a trust. And one tool that we find particularly of interest to landowners is what's known as retained life estate. Essentially, a landowner conveys their property, retains life use to rent it or farm it, and when they pass away, the land then comes into the ownership of a nonprofit such as AFT. There's some more sort of detailed arrangements known as charitable remainder trusts that can be used to generate income for landowners who donate their property to a nonprofit, as well as bargain sales where there's a part sale, part gift that generates some proceeds that can be paid out over a term of years. And we've explored those possibilities with many landowners as well. So to sum up, again, the main goal of a conservation option is to protect the farm for future agricultural use. And again, that's the position we start with when we work with landowners. I find, generally speaking, if financial concerns are driving a transaction or the interest in a tax deduction, to me, those are sort of the benefits. But I think the primary goal I find in most cases is to protect the farm for future agricultural use. Some cases, depending on the scenario, if there's public funding, can generate income for retirement. Depending on how it's structured, sometimes these can avoid or reduce capital gains taxes, certainly can help reduce or minimize other transfer taxes, such as gift taxes or estate taxes. And depending on the scenario and the situation of the landowner, can certainly support conservation organizations like American Farmland Trust. Lastly, in terms of more information, the AFT website, farmland.org, has recently been revamped. It's much more user-friendly than it used to be, and it's now integrated with our Farmland Information Center, which Jen alluded to earlier, farmlandinfo.org. A lot of great information at the Farmland Information Center on farm transfer, farm leasing. Really, in my view, although I'm somewhat biased, a tremendously underutilized resource, but it's a great source of information on a wide range of farmland conservation issues. And then lastly is my email. I'm happy to field inquiries from folks who want more information, who have questions. It's part of my job now to answer these questions and try to get a good information out there. In addition to that, I have developed 3 brochures. One is talking about our Farm Legacy Program. Another is actually conservation options. It's the brochure version of this webinar. And then a more general farm transfer brochure, Your Land is Your Legacy, which talks about farmland transfer issues, farm transfer issues a bit more generally. These are available at the farmland.org website, but I have electronic versions that I'm happy to email to folks. And for those who want a hard copy, if you send me an email, I'm happy to, with your address, I'm happy to drop some information in the mail to you as well. So with that, I will open it up for questions. I'm, again, pleased to be able to provide this information, and certainly if folks have questions now, or again, if they occur to you after the webinar, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to respond as best I can to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing, Jerry. We do have time for Q&A, and we'll be accepting questions from the audience. We are going to give attendees 1 minute to submit their questions. Please enter your questions into the question box on your screen. We will be back on to answer questions in approximately 1 minute. Okay, so we're going to get started with the Q&A. First, I just want to let everybody know we did have something pop up on the screen on my side indicating we might have some technical difficulties. Hopefully we should be okay, but I just want everybody to be aware and bear with us. So we'll get started with the Q&A, and the first question, Jerry, is going to be, is tourism and the buildings that are required an acceptable use for a PDR? As operations get smaller, many are incorporating tourism, which requires parking and buildings that do not fit as well into an ag assessment, and towns are requiring permits for these. Would the land they are on be accepted as a PDR?
Great question. So let me first clarify that the local land use regulations are separate from the restrictions in the conservation easement. So the easement essentially is not going to sort of override any local regulation. So if the town has requirements, the easement's not going to have an impact on that. That said, in my view, a well-drafted conservation easement should allow for what I would call agritourism. And again, I think the key, there are really two keys in terms of, thinking about it are, one, the scale, so that by and large, the agritourism needs to be sort of supportive of and compatible with the agricultural use. In most cases, that's not a problem. And And secondly, sort of the scale is sort of related to, the amount of traffic, the amount of people, being in a position to manage that safely. One way, again, in terms of uses in New York State, where I've done a lot of work over the years, the concept of agritourism is well established as part of the agricultural compatible use. But again, that's probably something that you want to have a conversation about in terms of use, as well as designating it as an allowed use within a building envelope, for example, that buildings could be repurposed to accommodate agritourism. There might be provisions for temporary parking. Again, most well-drafted easements, in my view, will allow for at least some agritourism. You may get into situations where if the agritourism becomes sort of the main driver of the farming operation, that could potentially be an issue down the road.
Okay, next question is, should farmland estate planning advice be state specific, i.e. how variable by state is land tax and easement regulation and policy?
Good question. I think at the end of the day, for the when you're starting to draft the documents, you want to make sure that you're complying with state-specific laws in terms of easements and with state-specific statutes in terms of gift taxes or inheritance taxes. Again, not all states have them. That's going to be a factor too. In terms of the basic issues and approach, I wouldn't say they're universal, but there's more commonality in terms of the larger issues, I think, across states than differences. There may also be regional differences in terms of agriculture, in terms of scale. I mean, one example is, early in my career, I went out and did some work, talked with landowners who had ranches, in the high plains of Colorado, and the scale, was, by magnitude of thousands of acres. These are operations that had, 10,000 acres, and a large farm in New York State is 1,000. And similarly, when you go to Long Island, a large farm on Long Island is, 25 acres. So there are going to be regional differences, but for the most part, the principles, and I've tried to keep them fairly general, I think are pretty much will translate from state to state and region to region, with some obviously significant differences once you get down into the actual details of the planning.
Okay, next question is, how do you enforce the land use / management agreement if those practices aren't being followed? Can it become a legal matter?
I'll give, I would be remiss if I didn't give the lawyer answer of it depends. It really depends on the language in the easement in terms of how prescriptive the easement is in terms of farming practices. Most easements will have fairly general language about appropriate conservation practices, usually incorporating terms like sound agricultural practices or generally accepted best management practices. And so those are some standards, and I think in egregious cases, probably would give rise to, frankly, the need for enforcement. In terms of at the other end of the spectrum, it's very, and we certainly don't encourage folks to put in what I would call more detailed prescriptive requirements in the conservation easement, such as requiring a certain very specific kind of practice, or perhaps organic agriculture. Again, those are good practices, but probably from our perspective, better addressed outside of the permanent conservation easement.
Next question is, do you feel large solar fields are a conflict with ag development rights, especially on prime farmland? States promote and fund both.
That's a great question. I think it's an issue that's in flux, because if again, my understanding is that it really depends on how accommodating the large solar installations are for agricultural use. You know, we think right now of the traditional wall-to-wall solar arrays. But if you look at some of the solar installations in Europe, for example, those installations are amazingly compatible with agriculture. So I think it's going to really depend on the type of solar installation and sort of deciding whether there can be some sort of accommodation to allow for a significant amount of solar and agricultural productivity. Again, I'm not an expert on it, but I've seen in enough some of the installations in Europe where I think there's going to be potential to be more creative, and so that it's not necessarily an either or.
Next question is it wise to have more than one appraiser determine values on land, buildings, housing, and machinery?
I would say only if, you know, you're concerned that the appraiser is not getting it right. You know, and again, this is doesn't hurt to get a second opinion. You know, again, I hate to spend folks' money on additional consultants because, you know, good appraisers are not free. So it's really, I think, a question of sometimes it's a gut sense or having another advisor take a look. You know, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be an appraiser. I mean, there are many attorneys who are, you know, can have a gut reaction to a valuation number about whether it's in the ballpark. And similarly, you know, you may get an appraisal and, you know, assuming they don't work for the same company, you know, you might have your lender take a look at it to make sure that it's sort of, you know, doesn't look too far off. So there's no, you know, one right answer to that necessarily, but I think it is important to recognize that, you know, there may be instances where you want a second opinion, and you may, you know, again, may justify spending the money on an additional appraisal.
Okay, next question is, how could you include farm areas that are off limits to any type of modifications or tillage, such as woods or swamps? What is the best way to enforce the agreement?
That to me sounds like an area that you may want to identify as a resource protection area, map it, make that, you know, part of the conservation easement map attached to the easement with a different set of management requirements. You know, in some cases it might be no management, or it might be no tillage, again, no tree cutting. There's a lot of different management parameters you could apply to a certain area. I mean, I think that the key will be having something that's relatively easy to identify spatially, and then outlining, you know, what additional restrictions, protections might be appropriate for that part of the farm.
Next question is, would you suggest finding an outside source to help write a transfer agreement? If yes, where would you suggest finding this person?
The short answer is yes. You know, again, depending on where you are in the country, some potential resources could be, you know, your local bar association, if there are attorneys who practice agricultural law. In many cases, your lender might know of attorneys who work with farmers. Again, here in the Northeast, Farm Credit East has consultants that work with farmers on, you know, farm transfer arrangements. So there's, I think, you know, some resources that you could look for, you know, word of mouth, you know, talk to your neighbor. Who did they use? What did they think? But I think you definitely want to sort of ask around and try to be an informed consumer, and, you know, try to get someone who's familiar with sort of the legal components, but also somewhat conversant in agriculture and agricultural issues.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. I want to thank you again, Jerry, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work.
Happy to do it. I'd like to acknowledge our funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible.
in particular the Great Lakes Protection Fund, American Farmland Trust, and SPARC. I'd also like to thank PARM's premier egg retailer members, the Andersons, a gold member, and silver members, Gertie Egg and Nutrient Egg Solutions. Their contributions helped make this webinar possible and help promote the strides that egg retailers are making to reduce nutrient impairments. For more information on membership, contact our project manager, Caitlin, at partnershipfarm.org. The PARM team also provides several free resources for egg retailers, grower clients, and consultants. On the left is our continually updated and 4R approved agronomist handbook, available free for download. Our phosphorus loss reduction wallet cards in the lower left corner can also be ordered for free on our website. PARM also offers several incentive programs for egg retailers. Find out more under the Egg Retailer tab on our website. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the follow-up email in a few days with a webinar evaluation and webinar recording. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are viewing this webinar live or the recording within 2 weeks of the original date, your CEUs will be automatically submitted. Only if you are watching the recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast date do you need to email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your CEUs are submitted. One last reminder to please take the webinar evaluation. The link to the survey is provided on this slide and will also be emailed to all registrants in a few days. This survey is a great way to let us know what topics you want to hear about on future webinars. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you join us again for our next webinar later this month.